Or do they want me? If I can demonstrate its value, then more celebrated examples should follow easily. So, The Wonders is a compendium of marvelous creatures, places, and plants based on classical, patristic, and early medieval texts. This version is known by its shelf mark as Vitellius, also known as the Beowulf manuscript after its most famous content. I'll briefly say one sentence. The Wonders in its context, and then investigate the manners in which it causes us to rethink our notions of monstrosity and its relationship to the construction of knowledge. In short, the only extant medieval copy of Beowulf, along with Old English versions of the Passion of St. Christopher. Anybody have a St. Christopher's medallion on? You know that he was a dog-headed giant in the Middle Ages, right? Just saying. Passion of St. Christopher, the Letter of Alexander to Aristotle, and Judith, the Tale of Judith in full fairness, are bound together with the Wonders in the manuscript known as London, British Library, copy Vitellius, A15, produced in England around the year 1000. Very rough. The art history of these images has been rather limited. That means nothing. Elzbieta Temple, one of the few art historians to even touch on these images, and she only does so because she's writing a catalog on every Anglo-Saxon image, refers to them as, quote, rather rough and incompetent. Though she acknowledges they are not, quote, without their own fascination. Kenneth Sison refers to what he sees as the childish draftsmanship of the illustrations. Andy Orchard cannot get himself to comment directly on these images at all, though he denigrates them by contrast with the later Tiberius marvels of these, which he says contains a fuller and much finer set of illustrations. Recent studies of the Wonders continue this trend. Cohen, for example, in the opening chapter of his wonderful study of giants, turns his critical attention briefly to the Wonders and justifies the move, with the argument that the Wonders is, after all, quote, bound in monstrous affiliation with Beowulf. But Cohen then directs his admittedly insightful reading to an image not from the Beowulf manuscript, but from the later Tiberius version, again, an image quite different from that in Vitellius. Similarly, Andy Orchard's Pride and Prodigies, studies of the monsters of the Beowulf manuscript, yes, contains on its cover an image not from the Beowulf manuscript, but again from the Tiberius manuscript. While I would not argue that the Beowulf manuscript is evidence of technically superior artistry, there is a resonance between the contents of this manuscript. In particular, the contents of this manuscript, in particular this version of the Wonders of the East, and the terms of rejection directed metonymically at Vitellius, and I would argue in monster studies, characterized as rough and incompetent. Other scholars I cut for the sake of decency refer to it as indecent and perverse. Though even critical examinations which had Beowulf manuscript as their primary focus turn away from this text at these images, I am certain there must be something in them, albeit something rough, that calls for our attention. And this something is, I think, at the heart of why I study monsters, why I want to spend my time dealing with such murky material. Much of this interest has to do with framing. The frames of the Wonders are a mess. Some have frames open on one side, like the burning hands at the top who set fire to anyone who approaches them, or the rather disgusting two-headed creatures below who set fire to anyone who approaches them. But others break through their frames entirely, like this Ono Centaur. Some have frames that seem to be part of their own setting, and others have frames with nothing but a ground line. Still others have no frames at all. And therefore, these monsters are free to attack their text, as one of those little nasty ant dogs at the top is doing. As Michael Camille has argued, the transgressive play in the margins of manuscripts, all those hybrids and well-endowed sciapods and defecating monkeys of the Gothic period, remains play as long as it's confined to the margins, even of very straight texts like the Psalter here. But the Vitellius Wonders do not allow for that separate space of safe transgression. Monsters were not always relegated to the margins. Here and elsewhere, they are the center of the work. Our first glance at them reveals, as always, what we expect to see. Hybrids made like Frankenstein's monster by sewing together bits and pieces of other creatures. The legs of a bird, the body of a sheep, the ears of an ass, that's the top guy. Or perhaps more lordly, the body of a horse conjoined without transition to the torso of man. But some of the textual descriptions of the wonders, like that of the Ono centaur here, suggest not literal but figurative hybridity. The Ono centaurs, we read, have human shapes up to the navel, and below that are like ants. It is easy to imagine the Ono centaur as a literal hybrid. It's a creature with the upper parts of a man and the lower parts of an ass. But the text maintains quite clearly that this creature has the shape of a human above and is like an ass below. Rather than a literal hybrid of two distinct beings joined together to produce a monster, we have a creature not made of the parts of any other being, but rather having parts that look like those belonging to known creatures. This distinction is important in two respects. First, it means that at least some of these creatures are not hybrids, as we're so often used to hearing them called. Second, it means that they are no more and no less likely to exist, no more and no less plausible and conceivable than those members of the wonders that we often skip past on account of their familiarity to us. The camels, for example, or the gentle, oyster-eating bishop. Oyster-eating bishop? Indeed, a camel would have been no more familiar in Anglo-Saxon England than an Ono centaur, and both would have been known only through geographies, encyclopedias, and travel tales like this text. Essentially, while these creatures are all in some way wondrous or marvelous, these are the terms medievals used to describe them, they cannot simply be labeled as monsters or species of monsters and then safely filed away. Why? First, we have to remember the true value of these descriptions for their Anglo-Saxon audiences. These creatures were wondrous in the sense that they are ungefräglich, unheard of, unknown, even inconceivable, but they are not imagined. For their original audience, they exist. The second is that because they are ungefräglich, we can only know them in the way that we can know things we've never seen, touched, or been torn apart by. We know them only through text and image. So it's no surprise that so many medieval and contemporary commentators take up the etymological association of monster with monstrari to show, to demonstrate, and read the monster as itself a sign, or even as a representation of the sign. In this way, monsters would function in the Middle Ages in much the same way as images of sacred or divine figures, which were likewise to be understood not as the actual thing, but as mere images thereof, as in the Lindisfarne Gospel's wonderful insistence that the tetramorph, the winged lion up there, one of the four, is imago leones, image of a lion, so that you don't confuse that with an actual lion. Yet, as I have been arguing, the creatures of the Vitellius wonders at least resist such readings, often instead seeming to serve as representations of the limits by which we signify, as they ask us again and again to locate ourselves in those moments where our strategies for reading and viewing meaningfully are confounded. Bruno Roy has suggested that monster catalogs may be conceived of as a strategy for naming what can go wrong with the human body, the animal world. And by so naming those abnormalities, of reassuring the readers of their own normality. But the wonders suggest that even this process of naming is already destabilized. Even on the most explicit level, these monsters are described as ungefräglich. Even after they are named, they remain unheard of. Even after you've read a description of them and seen a picture, they remain inconceivable. In this way, they serve as a metonym for much contemporary work in history, literature, and art history, which serves to break down crisp and clear, but also completely contrived narratives. The narratives spun simply do not equate to the flow of actual history and culture. So, too, in art history, we've been steadily eroding the canon as we interrogate the very basis of canonicity. Michael Camille writes, canonical works are usually described as those that have been stripped of their contingency, their particular place in space and time, and that now stand alone as works of art. Camille then writes that he wishes to construct a new canon. A canon of monsters, he says, of the slimy, the feathery, and scaly, but this canon would serve to reflect on the larger efforts of canonization practiced by art history and our sister disciplines, by including works that do not transcend space and time and stand autonomous, but which, in contrast, by their very monstrous nature, being unstable, cross boundaries, mingling the appropriate and inappropriate in constantly novel and unexpected ways.